Um, so there's been a rise in anti-Asian crime over the past year, and to be honest, this isn't one of those things that. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. So a lot of things happen on the news, all right, and we don't talk about every single thing in the service, all right. We believe that the Sunday service is the Sunday service, and we shouldn't be dictated by what goes on a weekly basis, and so we shouldn't be co-opting our services just because something happens this week or something happens that week. And so there's a lot of things that happen, and we never mention them in the service. But there are a few things that happen on a large enough scale, and it's relevant enough to us that we feel like it's worth mentioning. And whenever things happen in relation to race, oftentimes we feel like it's important to mention because one of our goals as a church is to be a multi-ethnic, multicultural church. We want to reflect our city and all of its demographics, not just so that our photos can look nice on some pamphlet or whatever, but because we believe that diversity reflects the heart of God. And so this is one of our core values. And the breaking down of racial and socioeconomic barriers in the church, this is something that we believe very much in. And it's not just, because it's a hip thing to do, because we think it's a biblical principle. This idea of breaking down barriers between different people groups, we think that's a major theme in books of Luke and books of and Acts and Galatians and 1 Corinthians. There's a lot of language about this in the Bible, and I would just, I don't think growing up in the church, I realized that when I was growing up in the church, I don't think I heard a single sermon on race for the first 18 years of my life, and it was only in adulthood, reading the Bible anew and being informed by a lot of different things going on in our culture, I realized this is a major theme in the Bible, and that I believe has been underemphasized in a lot of Christian circles throughout modern history. And so when something happens at the national level or the global level that has major implications relating to race, we do think it is important to talk a little bit about, not just because it's on many of our minds, but because it is relevant to one of our core callings at the Village Church. Because we are striving to be a multi-ethnic, multicultural church. When it comes to this specific issue of anti-Asian racism, many people are experiencing this in a variety of ways. Okay, so my intention is not to get political, and I totally understand that many people are at different points of the spectrum when it comes to their politics or their understanding of racism and their personal experiences of racism. And so I'm just going to say what I experience, okay? And so I think it's appropriate for me to share what I'm going through. And I'll confess, whenever I hear stories of anti-Asian racism, my natural instinct is to brush them under the rug. I don't think this is super uncommon among a lot of Asian Americans. I've talked to a few folks, and anecdotal, I don't know the statistics, but I think a lot of Asians, we do this. When we hear of stories of racism against Asians, we just sort of brush them under the rug and pretend like they never happened. Because our culture has taught us not to complain. Our culture has taught us to just simply quietly persevere in the middle of suffering, just accept your lot in life, and don't draw too much attention to yourselves, right? And there's all sorts of maybe historical reasons, religious reasons, cultural reasons for this, but that's one of our tendencies, speaking in broad strokes, of course, is we minimize the amount of suffering we experience, and we just put our head down, we just keep moving forward, and in doing so, we perpetuate the model minority myth. Over the past year, when I was reading stories about vandalism and violence committed against Asian Americans, that's often what I did. I just assumed, oh, there it is again, and I'll just move on with my life. And I try not to think about it too much. That's, just to be honest, that's what I did. And if you're not familiar, just some examples. On January 28th this year, an 84-year-old Thai American man was going out on a walk in San Francisco, and he was killed. On February 3rd, a 61-year-old Filipino-American man on the subway in New York was slashed in the face with a box cutter. On March 9th, an 83-year-old Korean woman in New York was collecting bottles and cans for money, and a stranger walked up, spit in her face, and punched her in the face. And that same day, March 9th, a 75-year-old Chinese man in Oakland was going for a walk. He was robbed and killed. And of course, this past Tuesday, 8 people were killed in the Atlanta area, 6 of those being Asian. And you can look this up. I mean, yesterday I was just Wikipedia and just look. There are dozens of cases just right there with links, and you can read them all up on your own of these sort of things. And it's surreal that many people are talking about anti-Asian racism and crimes now, because to a lot of Asian Americans, discrimination is sort of, what I'll just speak for myself, okay? Discrimination is sort of how we do life. And it's almost like this accepted reality of life. We're just these perpetual outsiders. We have funny names. We eat funny foods. And this is our lot in life. And it's interesting now that so many people that we never thought gave a care in the world are now bringing this up. And, when I was in my 20s, I remember I learned about the Chinese massacre of 1871. And if you're not familiar, this is what many people call the largest mass lynching in American history, in which a mob of 500 people stormed the LA Chinatown, and they lynched 15 people and killed several others. I also learned about the Hell's Canyon Massacre, in the late 1800s as well, in which a bunch of men ambushed and murdered 34 Chinese miners in Oregon. I learned about the murder of Vincent Chin in Michigan, 1982. And I remember just being so surprised that I never knew that these things happened. I was an adult in the USA. I was an Asian American myself, and I never learned about them in school. I never talked about them with my family, never talked about them with my friends. I just didn't know. And I think it's because we as Asian Americans were often taught not to make a big deal out of things. We just, stick to what, the responsibilities in front of us. We don't worry about things outside of our control. But I realize this culture, or this way of handling problems, this way that I am right now, even this past year, just brushing things under the rug, that's antithetical to the heart of God. In the words of Elie Wiesel, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And I realized I needed to repent personally of my indifference to some of these crimes going on in our country. If it is true we're all divine image bearers of God, then it is proper and right for us to grieve. It is proper and right for us to lament. It is proper and right for us to advocate for justice. And I don't think that's a political thing. I think this is just a biblical thing. I think as Christians, we need to be concerned and we need to be compassionate. We need to be empathetic when crimes happen at a large scale and you see a pattern in our country. I think it's times like these when our nation's conscience is being pricked that we need to have conversations. So regardless of who you are, regardless of whether you're white, black, Asian, Latino, something else, if we are going to be a multi-ethnic church, I think it means that we need to be intentional about having these sort of conversations. We need to be getting to know one another. We need to be practicing empathy toward one another. We need to bear one another's burdens, as it says in Galatians, and as it says in Romans, we need to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. I think that's not an extra credit thing. I think that's what it means to be a human. I think that's what it means to be a Christian, especially if you attend a multicultural church. And so I do encourage you to do whatever it takes to make that happen. There's a variety of different pathways for us. I don't think there's one way to do things, but I do think it's important for us to have serious conversations and to learn from one another. Maybe it's get educated. Maybe it's repent. Maybe it's have a conversation with someone. If you're interested in lamenting together with other people, our church is co-hosting a lament and intercession vigil this Wednesday at 8 p.m. This is a joint effort put together by a bunch of different Baltimore churches, and it's held at St. Moses Church in Charles Village. And they've asked that those who are interested, please register in advance because they don't want to exceed a certain attendance limit. And so you can do that. We have a convenient short link, villagehampden.com/lament. And wear masks and practice distancing if you want to attend. But that's just an opportunity where different folks from different churches will be sharing a little bit, and we can be lamenting together about some of the events that happened in Atlanta. But regardless of your plan of action, let's just take this seriously for one another's sake. Let's experience reconciliation and unity. Some of these conversations may be difficult to have, but I think that difficult conversations are often necessary in order to achieve true reconciliation and true unity. All right, so let's do that. As we talked about last week, Jesus prayed that the church, that we would be one. so that the world may know that we are his disciples. So let's try to do that.